Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Safest Family on the Block, where knowledge is power. I'm your host, Jason, and joining me today is Joe Saunders of the MVP, the Managing Violence podcast. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm so excited to have you on, man. You know, you've had a guest list. We have a lot of guests in common over the years. You've had Beverly Baker, Mark McYoung, Rory, Alan Burris, Spencer Corson, who I particularly like because I actually got to speak to a private investigator named Spencer.
Yes.
How often do you get to do that? But let's go ahead and start a conversation with tell our viewers a little bit about your show and how it happened and what brought you to it.
Sure. So the Managing Violence podcast, it's been going now for about 3 and a bit years. We've just hit episode 100, just released a couple of days ago, which is a milestone that was certainly not something I expected when I started it. I started it literally just as an idea of a conversations I wanted to have or conversations I wanted to listen to more than anything. I guess I'll go back into my background as we circle back, but I'd been involved in martial arts, combatives, violence prevention, reality-based self-defense for a long time, and I was an avid podcast listener. And I started looking for conversations. I wanted to try and find podcasts that were about that, and I figured like it's a niche, but it's not that small of a niche. Surely someone's got a show doing this stuff. And the one that caught my ear was Rory Miller. I was like, I'd love to. I just reread one of Rory's books, and I was like, I'd love to hear someone talk to Rory about his stuff. And I searched for it, and I found a number of podcasts that he'd done. And when I listened to them, they were so superficial because they were like health and safety podcasts, or they were a fitness podcast, or they were just a general advice for your teenage son podcast. And they were cool, but it was kind of like reading the blurb of the book, right? And I was like, I don't want to read the blurb. I want to go deeper than the pages. Like I want to ask him things about that aren't written because I've read the books and I love the books and they've made up part of my journey. I want to know more than that. I thought, well, surely someone's doing this, and it turns out no one was. So I thought, well, I've got some stuff to say, and I was starting up a new club, which was a short-term venture, but I was starting up a self-defense club, and I thought, well, this could be another avenue to market for me to sort of share some of my expertise and some of my knowledge, and maybe if it gets some traction, I could get some guests. And Rory was sort of on my list as like a bucket list guest, right? I was gonna one day when I'm famous enough, Rory Miller will be on my show. As it turns out, we were connected on Facebook. I sent him just a message saying, "Hey, I'm starting this show. I would love it if one day you'd be on my show." He's like, "Sure, when do you want to do it?" I'm like, "Oh, okay, we can do this now." And all of a sudden, I'm like episode 5 or something. I'm chatting to Rory Miller, and we became good friends. He's been on the show 3 times. And I suddenly realized that all these people I'd idolized, people whose books I'd read, people whose teachings I had bootlegged VHSs and DVDs around the world for, were actually super approachable and really chilled out, most of them. And they're more than happy to have a conversation with an Aussie guy who loved their stuff. And that was kind of the genesis of the podcast. And it just became this beast of a thing where, we've kind of interviewed, there's only a handful of people that I have on a list of a who's who that haven't been on the show. Some of them because they like to get paid for doing their interviews, and that's cool. And some of them just hasn't worked out yet. So it's become this amazing catalog of expertise and something that is now kind of more of I wouldn't say a legacy project because it's not about me, but it's kind of something that I want to sustain because I wish I'd had this repository of knowledge available to me when I was starting out. And there was no one place to go. It was the back of Black Belt magazine, and trusting the dodgy advertising with the skulls and the dragons, and like that looks pretty badass. That's going to be good. It's I guess that's the long and short version of the origin of the podcast, and it's evolved over the time. It started off being very self-defense focused because that was my niche and that was my people. And over the time, it's become much more about violence prevention and management, incorporating people from the threat assessment world, people from the security world, the executive protection world, et cetera, which is really in line with what I do professionally, which is prevention and management of violence.
Outstanding. That puts me in mind. I did Tom Callis's ultimate black belt test a couple of times. And one of the requirements as that evolved was to get video of yourself training, get video of your instructors training, because one of the things that Tom kind of really got into for a while was the idea of how much do we wish that our teachers' teachers had a phone on their camera.
Oh yeah.
Right. Like how much do we wish that there was just casual video of Ip Man teaching a class or of Ed Parker teaching a class, you know? And so that's this is exactly the kind of work I'm hoping folks do. And that's very similar to how this podcast, my own show came about, which was I was trying to find the show that I needed as a security-minded parent with a martial arts background, and there wasn't one. You know, one of my pet peeves in the industry is when you look for self-defense and safety advice on the media, usually you got one of two people doing it. Either it's a journalist on a tight deadline who doesn't really know what they're talking about and is as likely to share bad information as good, or it's a martial arts nerd like us or a deep professional operator, neither of whom have a context that your average soccer mom or minivan dad is appropriate for.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. Honestly, like I've developed this like weird second income where I now sort of translate martial arts and security experts to regular people. It's sort of like I'm now coaching people how to talk to regular people, because people like you and I aren't usually regular. So
my favorite example of that. My favorite example of that was I started watching some of Clint Emerson's videos when he broke big about 2 years ago. Yeah. And he had a video of self-defense advice for civilians, including this trick about taking a tampon applicator, putting a razor blade and a handcuff key in it, and then putting it up in you, just in case you get captured. And I'm thinking that as a suburban middle-aged father, if I'm actually seriously considering that, I have made so many mistakes.
Yeah, the self-defense should have started a lot with your choices of lifestyle and friendship groups. Yeah, exactly.
So what I wanted to have you on the show for was because you've had a chance to interview a whole lot of real experts and just get what were some of the most important takeaways that you gained either in the interview or thinking about the interviews later as applies to those conversations with civilians, conversations with parents. What could parents take away from what you've learned and distilled over the years of doing the podcast?
Yeah, it's a great question. And when you flagged that with me ahead of time, I was like, it's something that I do reflect upon. And it's very, very hard for me to separate where I learned something from, because I'm having these great conversations. And I always say it's like the world's weirdest and best apprenticeship that I've had, like 3 years of literally the best minds in the world on subjects, and be able to pick their brain for an hour at a time. But
do you ever have those moments where you're talking to these guys and you think about your own martial arts background and you think, you sort of, wow, I had this adorable idea that I knew what I was talking about before I started having these conversations. Wow, I knew nothing.
Thankfully, I think I was very past that before I had the conversation. I kind of went in with a slightly emptier cup than I might have had if I'd done it in my 20s. But look, I had a security background as well. I had a executive protection bodyguarding background, and I've got 4 young kids. So like to your point, like the context is always apparent to me about what we're talking about and how we're talking about it. But yeah, I mean, at the same time we're doing this podcast, I've also been running Australia's largest violence prevention practice, working in workplaces with vulnerable people as well, and coaching this through. So it's probably a combination of things that some of them are tangential to the podcast, some of them are directly from guests. But there are absolutely some key learnings that I think quote unquote regular people can apply without having to worry about tampon insertion. So probably I guess to start, I mean, the biggest thing that I think a lot of people misunderstand about violence when it comes to their family is that they assume that it's going to be someone from the outside. They assume that it's going to be a home intruder. It's going to be the crackhead trying to steal your kid's bike, or it's going to be someone trying to steal the keys to the Mercedes, and absolutely all those are potentially real risk. And I mean, so I'd argue that self-defense then comes down to choosing the right neighborhood, making sure you have a lockable garage so your car isn't visible from the street, like those kind of home security considerations. But I think the big piece from a violence prevention angle is understanding where your actual threat vectors are. And the threat vector that's most likely hit you in the family when it comes to violence is someone that you've invited into your home. So this isn't sexy, right? You can't fix it with a hammer. Right? It's something that how well are you judging character? How much trust are you putting in random people that have put themselves in a position where they can be trusted? We know, especially with the work I've done with victims of domestic violence, with rape victims, something like up to 80% of people that are raped by someone that they knew, right? A family member, a colleague at work, or someone they were dating. So why are we spending time working on how to do a triangle from guard when we should be working on how to recognize those red flags of abusive and controlling behaviors that may eventually lead to violence happening in your home? So, like, I've got 4 daughters. With 4 young daughters, like I'm not teaching. Like, yeah, they're learning how to defend themselves, but it's more about setting good boundaries, understanding those behaviors of concern, flagging when something doesn't make you feel comfortable. Like, those are the things that I'm teaching my kids now. And when I'm talking to regular people that are concerned about their kids' safety, it's like, well, who are you inviting to be around your kid? And what controls have you got in place? And it's you. I mean, it's never the person that gave you the creeps initially, right? It's the person that you trusted implicitly because of their profession or because they put themselves in a position. And this is key, right? These predators will put themselves in a position where they're trustworthy. Not necessarily they're trustworthy, but they put themselves in a position where they appear trustworthy. So you just happen to be in the right place at the right time when you got that flat tire, or that the person who just happened to be in the right place that stopped your kid from running down the street when you weren't paying attention. So, well, were they, or was that manufactured way to earn your trust?
Yeah.
Like, these are some of the things that I think parents need to start looking at if they're serious about their safety, and not just looking for an excuse to buy a gun or to drop $100 a month at jiu-jitsu. I'm not saying any of those are bad things, but let's be honest about our motivations, about what we're actually trying to achieve. So
absolutely. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it was in season 3, I was lucky enough to interview the captain of an SBU unit in New Jersey. Wow. And I asked her to talk about child lures, the guy in the candy van. And the first thing out of her mouth is, nope, we're not going to talk about that. That the frequency of that, although it does happen, amounts to a rounding error. We're going to talk about how to spot if somebody is victimizing a child. I mean, she wouldn't even have that other conversation because of how rarely she encountered it.
Yeah, wow.
And and we like to, we're martial arts people, action men. And you think about running across the street and pounding the crap out of somebody who's the wrong guy in a ice cream van and saving the day. But the skills that'll really save the day are things like trusting our intuition, teaching intuition, and laying the groundwork conversationally with our kids so that they feel comfortable coming to us when that adult that we thought we could trust is making them uncomfortable.
And honestly, like, this is for the dads in the room, because oftentimes we are guilty of this, is having a relationship with our kids where we can notice when something's off. We can notice behavior has changed. We can notice when it just seemed to be like, and oftentimes, especially if you're the sole breadwinner and you're working long hours, every time you see your kid is like when you get home from work or just before bedtime, you kind of miss on those nuances of their personality. And look, I've got, as I said, four daughters, all under the age of 9. Their personality changes every 5 minutes, but I can still pick up when something's not quite right, when there's a trend. And to your point, having those conversations so that you've got that open dialogue, that nothing's off limits, tell me anything, and making sure they feel like they'll actually be heard when they do talk. And this is something I work on all the time. Like, any dad out there or parent out there who brings work home for them, or like me, has been working from home for a couple of years now, like, you're constantly on a device, checking an email, doing something while they're talking to you. And sometimes you don't realize what they're talking to you is actually really important to them. So making sure that you kind of pull yourself up on that, and making sure that you've got the relationships and structures in place so that you can hear that stuff. And just to tie away, so to tangent slightly away from the child safety piece, even with home invasions, like a high percentage of them are people that you have been to your door, right? That have looked around. Like, are you identifying weird cars in the street? Are you identifying people that are door knocking without appropriate identification on? People that just seem to want to come into your house for no apparent reason. They're not happy to take no at the door. They want to get a foot in the door and look around and maybe look for signs of valuables, or like all those kinds of pieces. That awareness is so huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, that's a great start and a huge takeaway that violence, most victimization is not going to be from a stranger,
Mm.
and it's not going to be something that we meet with a fist or a handgun, but something that we meet in very, very different ways. And I imagine that's been a through line through a lot of your interviews.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely.
yeah. Now, what have been some other ones? Some real important takeaways, especially as a dad of 4 young kids. I mean, there's some other ones I imagine hit home really hard.
Yeah. So there's a couple that are
Mhm.
probably connected to that, and this one
Yeah.
came from Jeff Thompson. Like Jeff Thompson is for anyone in the martial arts or who was around the reality-based self-defense movement in the '90s, especially. Like Jeff Thompson was like the godfather of reality-based self-defense at the time. Pioneered Animal Day and wrote 50, I think it's like 50 books now. Like it's just an incredibly prolific writer. Jeff has come so far from the man he used to be. Like he was a very violent man working the doors in Coventry, and his first book, Watch My Back, is a testament to that. Jeff is probably the most gentle soul you'll ever meet now, to the point where like I've interviewed Jeff twice now, and both times like I felt like a better human being having left him just on Zoom. and but Jeff said something to me words to the effect of be careful that the violence in you doesn't become the violence in them. And what he was basically saying with that is sometimes when we are expecting violence, when we're looking for violence, we project that onto others. And we start assuming that everyone's a bad guy, everyone's a pedophile, everyone's a predator, and we look for an excuse for our violence because it's bubbling away under the surface. And this ties in very tightly to something that my great friend and mentor Richard Dimitri said, which is that 90% of violence is a result of trauma. So internal trauma, your own problems, your own dramas, your own stuff that's going on that leads to you making perhaps not very wise decisions, or potentially you just project a certain energy that riles up the trauma in somebody else, right? And then you end up with a completely preventable incident between what is essentially two broken people both thinking the other person started it, right? And that's so common, young men in particular, but even not so young men, right? And with women, it tends to manifest in relationships as opposed to just social violence. But that's a huge thing is being aware of your own baggage, your own traumas, your own triggers, and ensuring that you're actually looking at a situation objectively and not looking for an excuse to be a hero, to your point earlier. Because I've certainly been guilty of that in the past.
What was that book that all the hippies were reading around 2000? The Four Agreements, which all my hippie friends recommended it, but it turned out to be a great book. And what was the third agreement? Don't take things personally. That guy's not flipping you off in traffic. He's flipping off his boss in traffic, and you were handy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. He's a suitable replacement. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great point, right? So like you don't matter in their life.
Okay.
And it's hard for us to understand because we are the center of our own universe. So when someone does anything in our general direction, it has to be about us. It's like when people read a tweet or a Facebook post from a relative that's vague and kind of angry, and they're like, oh, that's about the conversation I had with them yesterday. Like, no, you're making an assumption because in your head, everything is about you. So therefore for them, it must be about you as well, which is seldom the case. But I think there's a lot of, there's a massive empathy gap. And that's probably another learning for, I think just about violence prevention in general, is that we would have a lot less conflict and a lot less violence if we all had just a little bit more empathy for each other. But to your point there, I mean, that surrogate factor of they're just mad about stuff. They're mad about the world, and you just happen to be the face that they can attach that to right now. Doesn't mean you should let them punch you in the face, but you also doesn't mean they're a terrible human being either.
And that can also drill down right to our interactions with our kids. When that 5-year-old's throwing the mother of all tantrums, it's almost never about what's happening in that moment. It's about a collection of things between getting up a little too early, not getting the snack they wanted 3 hours ago, and needing to pee.
Yeah.
And then their little body is full of big emotions, and they don't know how to manage it. And if we start taking that personally,
they're just cognitively overwhelmed, right? And this is exactly what happens to adults, by the way. I worked in healthcare for a number of years. I dealt with a lot of aggression and violence in healthcare, and 90% of it Yeah, obviously you've got, I won't say 90% because that'd be unfair because we dealt with a lot of drug and alcohol abuse and a lot of mental illness. But for the patients that were, or for the, they weren't always patients, for the aggressors that were not intoxicated and were not mentally ill, probably 90% of them was just, they were just cognitively overwhelmed by the situation they were in, and they lost control of their emotions because it was just too much. It was the parent at 3 a.m. in an emergency department who's had a kid screaming at them for 6 hours and they still haven't been seen. Like, that person is going to be angry, and if you go and tell them they have to sit down for the peace of everybody else, there's a good chance that they're not going to take that well. A little bit of empathy for that situation goes an awfully long way. So I think that's a big piece. Just I've got more I can say about empathy, but I'll stop there. So I'll try.
And on that topic, man, you've worked a door and you've raised toddlers.
Very similar.
Did it surprise you how similar the two experiences were?
I was surprised how much of my grappling training came in handy when I had to try and change diapers, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Preventing the bridge, stopping them from rolling. It all came in handy.
Or the dodging the headbutt when you're kind of holding them from behind like this and they're mad.
No, man. A lot of that. Yeah, it's funny. I do wonder how many of my tricks that I use for parenting were informed by my time dealing with someone else's kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I had an interview with a verbal judo instructor, a guy named Alex Bromley, and one of the points that he made was, verbal judo was designed in part to deal with people who were under the influence, and if you think that, and he kind of he expanded that into under the influence of teenage hormones, under the influence of sleep deprivation, under the influence of being a toddler and having no idea what's going on. Those are all other species of being under the influence, and kind of internalizing that can help us, keep it together when our kids have found exactly which button they need to push and are just sitting there going,
yep. And hey, look, if someone's experiencing reality different to you, it's going to be very, very hard for you to communicate from your reality to their reality. You got to meet in the middle somewhere, or alternatively, communication just isn't going to be an option. Working with acutely unwell people that have psychiatric conditions, like if you are a dragon in their mind right now, it's going to be very, very hard for you to tell them to calm down. Right? Then they're probably not going to listen to the dragon. The dragon's terrifying. They're probably going to want to kill the dragon. And that's just to use an example, right? If you're trying to talk to them calmly, but they're seeing zombie heads popping out of the ground in front of them, they're probably not going to be they're probably going to be a little bit distracted about the conversation. So if your realities are different, then the communication gets difficult. And that could be just someone, as you said, heightened emotions, hormones, whatever. If their reality is different to how you perceive it, then you're not starting on equal footing. So you have to have an understanding of where they're at to be able to structure that. A large part of what I do now is conflict communication training. So, and that's a huge part of what we do.
Doesn't Rory Miller tells a story in one of his books about when he was still working the jails. There was a guy who was completely agitated, very violent, convinced that everybody in the facility were vampires, and was ready to go down fighting. And Rory just kind of goes, "Dude, I'm a gypsy. Gypsies are immune to vampires, right?" And that was all it took.
Yep. Honestly, it's I mean, clinical best practice is you don't reinforce the delusion, but in the moment, if it means a difference between getting saved or not, it's sometimes it's a strategy.
Exactly.
I think there's so much to violence that we don't talk about. Because it's not exciting. It doesn't fit within a John Wick movie. I love watching a good John Wick movie, but that's not violence prevention. Like that's a macho testosterone fantasy film. Right? It's no different to your 55-year-old aunt reading a erotic novel. Right? It's the exact same experience.
Absolutely. Oh man, my train of thought just derailed. But it had to do with the violence about. Nobody ever spent $15 to go watch Jason Statham calm a guy down and buy him a beer.
Yeah, that's right. And I think sometimes I've just talked about this at length on my latest episode of my podcast, but I honestly think that the self-defense structure that we're operating in now is so far removed from both its origins and for its what an actual fit for purpose model would look like. But at some point, we need to stop patching and we need to start demolishing and starting again. And the analogy I've used in describing this is that you know when you walk into a house that was built 80 years ago and it was a little one bedroom with a living room and a kitchen off to the side, and that was it. And then as the next generation got a little bit more affluent, they built on an addition to it. And now there's 2 bedrooms and there's the outside bathroom's now inside. And then as it goes on, like it just gets built on and built on and built on. And now you can, if it's anything like here, you can walk into a house and like you have zero idea where to find anything because nothing makes any sense. Because like, oh, there was a support beam there, so we had to put the bedroom over there behind the bathroom. Like, why? Because that's just how it was. And I feel like in a way, the self-defense world is like that house that has been modified and patched and renovated so many times that it doesn't make any sense anymore. And we're still desperately trying to cling on to this original structure when the original structure was never what it needed to be in the first place. And I think the martial arts, and I love the martial arts. I'm a martial artist. It's always going to be part of me, but it's not violence prevention and management. It's martial arts. And even at the root of a lot of our martial arts, they were never about warfare and fighting and self-defense. They were about some sort of ritualistic practice. They were entertainment for royalty. They were they were always a hobby for the middle class. Not all of them come back. In fact, very, very few systems can trace their way back all the way to being purely warfare-based or self-defense based. And if they were, the societal pressures have shifted it so far from what we have now that they're not the same thing. So if that's our base product, it's almost like we got through World War I, World War II, especially when there's a big combatives push. A lot of people got exposure to some combatives methods. We started hearing about Fairbairn and Sykes and their research, and you started to see things about gross motor skills and all those kinds of pieces. And then I was like, oh, okay, so we can, some of this fine motor stuff in the martial arts doesn't work as well. And then you start seeing a bit of a transition there. And then Vietnam gives us some more insight into training methodologies. And we start adding in a bit of that there. But we still don't want to really get rid of the kata, or we still don't really want to get rid of the kicks. Have fun, and the kids love doing kicks. And then we get to the UFC in the 90s, and it's like, well, okay, now none of this stuff works, but we still want to keep these bits because this is who we are, but we're going to add in takedown defense. But we don't want to train takedown defense properly because then we wouldn't have time to do all the other stuff, right? So we end up with this like Frankenstein's monster of a bunch of cool concepts that on their own have merit, but as a package make no sense. And I think, and then you add in the fact that most martial arts dojos are more at risk of going out of business because they can't pay for the electricity bill than that one of their students gets mugged and killed, right? So
absolutely.
So there's got to be an entertainment factor. There's got to be an education factor. There's got to be a fun factor. All these things are pressures on the martial arts / self-defense community that mean that the end product is not always going to be the best possible way to address violence. And I think if we stop all that and go, what do people need to know to be safe from violence? And just start again, we'll end up with a much better product offering. I mentioned on the episode, I want people 10 years from now, if my kids want to learn how to defend themselves and I'm not around for any reason, I want them to be able to Google violence prevention and management and something comes up that is relevant, not self-defense, sift through 40 pages of Google to find something that's not rubbish. So
yeah,
it's kind of a vision for the future. But to your point, I mean, there's so much of this that we don't talk about, we don't teach, we don't unpack in detail. We say, oh, use verbal de-escalation, talk your way out. Cool. How do you practice that? We just tell them to try this. But hey, here's some kicking. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to go to the kicking. Right?
Yeah. I mean, you got to get up, glove up, and have a talk about it.
Yeah.
There's the drill. Right? The drills don't exist, or at least they're not well known.
Well, and this was a massive step for us, right? So if that's a curriculum, what does it look like? And it's one of the things. I've got a UK tour coming up in March and April. One of the things we're talking about a lot there is how do you train communication skills? And I have a product called the Martial Art of Communication, which is basically applying structure and syllabus to communication, same as if we were training it as a martial arts skill. And it's something it's always a work in development, because everyone, like, especially I'm going to be teaching in Switzerland as well, which is going to be interesting, teaching a different language, and hoping that the translation works well enough. But yeah,
heck, the Swiss speak English better than us Americans.
Yeah. I'm doing the seminar in English, and hoping everyone understands.
No, I absolutely agree. And one of the really interesting things that's happened in martial arts, because like you, I love my traditional training. You know, it's a Kempo guy for a long time, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, capoeira mostly because it keeps me fit.
Yeah.
But that problem that we have, that a lot of these systems are developed in a way that, at the very least, are a step removed from the realities of protecting yourself from a violent confrontation. Often far more than one step removed. But because, like I say, they are hobbies for the middle class in developed nations, that nobody ever gets in a situation where they find out, because being assaulted is vanishingly rare in the societies where martial arts lessons are taken. And that's good that our societies have evolved to that point. But I also think you get in a situation where you have dojos operating, successful dojos run by well-meaning, intelligent human beings, where the person running the school has never been in a physical altercation, neither had that person's teacher, and neither had that person's teacher. And they're going to tell us about the realities of how to handle a violent confrontation.
Yeah. And that's a common debate, right? Do you need to have been in a fight to be able to teach it? And I would, I've been guilty in the past of this, because I think we all go through these journeys of, like, I discovered something new, now I'm the smartest person in the land. And then after a while, you're like, oh, okay, that wasn't the be all end all. It just felt like it at the time. But it's like the first person who got their blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the 90s, and they're like, I actually own everybody now. Like, and they were, until everyone caught up. But I say, like, learning self-defense from someone who's never been in a fight is like learning to swim from someone who's never been wet. And that's unfair, because if you are teaching good material, it is good material regardless. The challenge is, if you don't have an experience as your reference point, it's hard to know what good material is. And I think that's probably a fairer assessment, is that the person who is writing your curriculum, or the person who is going to adjust your curriculum, should have some basis of reality. And then if there's any alterations to be made, you better pressure test the hell out of that thing to make sure that you actually have built something that is better, and there's not an obvious reason why it wasn't already being done that way. So
absolutely,
that's probably a piece for the instructors out there, because I do apologize for those that I've been kind of condescending towards. And look, I kind of got slapped in the face with this. A couple of years ago, I had a guy who listened to my podcast and sort of, I guess, came to me for advice on a lot of stuff. And he said, I'm thinking about getting a night job as a bouncer so I can get some experience with violence. I'm like, one, if that's your only motivation for taking that job, that's really bad. Two, I'm going to unleash you on society with the express purpose of you're trying to find a fight. Like, you are going to be terrible at that job, and you're going to get yourself in trouble, and you're probably going to hurt somebody who didn't need to be hurt, because you're looking for every possible opportunity to have a fight. So, that's, I kind of had to rein it in a bit there and go, what is the avenue for that person who wants to have that experience, or that assurity, without saying, hey, you should go out and pick some fights. So it's a balance.
And not for nothing, but the experience of a bouncer, I've worked a door, you've worked a door, is very different from the experience of violent crime. You showed up, you volunteered, you almost always saw it coming. You have a team at your back. The other guy's compromised 9 times out of 10.
Yep.
And the difference between that and somebody popping up next to your car with a blackjack or a knife, it's night and day.
Yep. It's a completely artificial scenario. It's like, to me, it's like really, really hard sparring has benefits, and you can throw in, like, if you do some good sort of stress testing drills where you might have multiple attacker sparring, or you might have a sparring session where someone pulls a knife and now you got to do it with a shock knife or something. That stuff has tremendous training benefit. The same as kind of working as a bouncer has tremendous training benefit. There are certain lessons I learned about what works, what doesn't, what hurts and what doesn't, what hurts later and what doesn't, like dealing with a law afterwards, managing adrenaline, like all those things I can talk to from personal experience. But it's not the same as talking to a 120-pound mum with a newborn wrapped to her chest who is worried about the weird guy who's following her back from the store. Like that's a different reality to anything I dealt with. So I better have, and therefore my experience with violence has no credibility or nor credence or waiting for how to teach her. I better have some knowledge that's going to help her that doesn't connect to me, because that's not my lived experience. So
yeah, that's one of my pet peeves, seeing the women's self-defense classes taught by a high school jock who went in the Marine Corps and spent the last 10 years as a cop.
Yep.
6'2", 200 pounds. It's, they have knowledge, and it's probably more knowledge than the average Minivan mom, but some of their knowledge is simply wrong.
I almost guarantee the course is going to be 90% physical.
Yeah.
When that absolutely should not be balanced. It should be 10% physical, 90% avoidance, de-escalation, situational awareness. But probably to come back to your original point about lessons, and we've given that you just said you had a 2-hour conversation with Mark McYoung, I guarantee this probably came up. But it's something that Mark said, and I've interviewed quite a number of people about it. There is this weird middle-aged man fantasy of violence that somehow doesn't involve any of the long-term consequences. And that is that if there was one thing I could scream from the rooftops to every dad in the world that thinks they're going to jump out of bed and grab their sidearm or grab their mag light and they're going to bludgeon someone to death, is, have you considered, and I don't mean just like a flash in like, the Law and Order dun 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 hits, like I don't mean that. I mean, like, have you really considered what happens next? Right? Let's say that it's completely justified. Someone was forcing entry to your home, they've busted through your door, you see a knife in their hand, you grab your mag light, you crack them over the head, that person dies on your doorstep. Right? Let's say that's a pretty plausible and realistically justifiable action. Okay, we're not even going to go into I shot the guy with his back turned. So justifiable action. What's your immediate reality with your kids with a corpse on your doorstep? Is that an experience you want for your kids? Like the blood splatters on your doorway? Like how does that conversation play out next? When the kids come out, when there's screaming in the house and your wife is freaking out and you're trying to call 911 and do I resuscitate him? Do I not? How many other people are there? Am I still looking around? Like, I guarantee your kids are getting counseling after this, right? At a minimum. Then the police come. Do you know how to talk to the police? Okay, are you 100% sure you saw a knife? Hey, what if they can't find the knife? What happens next? Right? What if this guy was just drunk and he thought he was breaking into his own house because he lost his key? Right? So, I mean, I'm not saying that you're going to be charged with this, but these are the questions that are going to be asked. And let's say that it's not as cut and dry, and you now have to go to court. You have to fund your own legal defense. Okay, goodbye 50, 100, 200K, depending how long this takes. Do you have that money? Okay. Do you have a lawyer? These are questions. Does that lawyer know what to do with a criminal charge? What happens if the family of the victim, you get acquitted criminally? What happens if the family of the victim wants to sue you for the loss of income that family member was providing for them, and now you've got to go through another couple of years in court? Right? Do you have the funds to sustain that? What about the stress on your relationship? What about the stress on your kids? What about the fact that you've got to live with the fact that you killed somebody? Okay, that someone else's family member who you knew nothing about in that 2 seconds that you interacted with them before they were dead. Like in the time afterwards, you'll learn a lot about them. There'll be media about them. You might find out this person was a good high school kid who got into drugs and just took a bad turn 2 years ago, and now they're ended up dead. Are you okay with killing that kid whose life may have been able to be turned around? I'm not casting any judgment. I'm just asking questions that need to be asked before we start fantasizing about jumping to physical responses to everything. In some situations, look, someone breaks into my house and they got a knife in their hand, I'm going to defend myself, and I'm not going to take chances with that 100%. But I've thought through these scenarios so that I am very confident that I'm not going to overreact, and I'm certainly not going to be wishing for the day when I get a chance to do it. I know if this happens, it will be life altering for me, for my kids, for my wife, for other people that are close to me. It's going to be incredibly stressful and traumatic for my parents. There's going to be a lot of factors that might go much beyond marksmanship, right? And this is the conversation we need to have about violence, because especially as men, we glorify it so much. But anyone who's really been there, done that, tends not to do that. And that's probably the biggest flag that there is, right? So,
no, absolutely that. And again, we're talking about how that physical training, the physical skills, represents such a huge spectrum of the training available. Whereas it's a tip of the iceberg situation where there's so much going on before that are ways to avoid having to go to be violent. Something as simple as, are you spending as much on the gun? Yeah, you spent this much money on the gun that you've got in the safe by the bed just in case. Did you spend at least that much money on the lock on your door?
Yeah.
Right. And then this stuff afterwards about the after violence, the knowing, the PTSD that you will have if you hurt somebody or get hurt, like the kids seeing it.
Yeah.
What will that do? I have two friends who defended one was a fiance and one was a wife from multiple attackers, because that was the town that they lived in. And that relationship was over before the end of the year, because that wife, that person in their life, couldn't handle being married to somebody that they saw do what that person did to keep her safe. All of these
reminder of the trauma, just the present reminder of the trauma, whether there's a judgment or not. Yeah,
absolutely. But that's all these skills, start to finish, and we spend a lot of time right here because that's the fun, sexy stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and it's just a mindset shift, right? I'm not saying don't train that stuff. By all means, that's the skills. To your point, like I'm a big fan. Professionally, I'm a risk manager. I manage risk. So what is the risk analysis of this? What is the risk assessment on my house? And where am I, if I have $1,000 to spend on my safety, is it better spent on hardware, or is it better spent on training, or is it better spent on weaponry, or like where am I going to get bang for my buck for $1,000? Like what's the thing? Or am I better off like fixing my fencing? Like is that going to be a better option? Am I better off getting a good floodlight? Am I better off getting a Ring doorbell? Like these are big questions that they're not nearly as satisfying as getting a new gun and taking it to the range. But they're probably like that gun is not deterring anybody unless you're waving it around outside your house, which is probably going to attract a whole bunch of new attention. So and look, again, there's no judgment here. It's just about getting people to start asking themselves the right questions.
Yeah, and also, it sounds like we're poo-pooing training, but clearly we're not, because we're both addicted to it. And there's that irony of it, right? That if you've got training after even a year, your chances of needing that training plummet, because bad guys, although they're cowardly dipshits who should be different people, they're good at their jobs. They're professionals. They're not going to pick you because of the way you walk, because of the way you look, because of the way you look at them. And so, the real value of training from a middle-class, middle-aged point of view is that you won't need it.
Yeah. And to a certain point, this was a revelation for me, right? I started off, so I guess the very short version of my experience with this, I started off training in martial arts when I was 4 years old. It was always a hobby. I liked Power Rangers, and I loved Hulk Hogan, and I wanted to be an action star, right? If I could have signed up for WWF wrestling as a kid, like I would have been there. But at that point, it was faux pas to put kids in cage matches, so I had to stick with Taekwondo instead. But I did traditional martial arts growing up. When I was about 15, I discovered combat sports through wrestling. So wrestling is not nearly as embedded here. It's very, very rare, especially around that time. It was very, very rare to find any wrestling. I just happened to be at a PCYC, which I guess is kind of like a YMCA, like a youth club sort of. I was just there lifting weights on the weekend. I came out, I saw some guys suplexing each other on gymnastics mats, and I was like, "What are these guys doing? That looks kind of cool." And I knew about MMA. This was, I guess, late 90s, early 2000s. I was an early MMA fan, and turns out these guys were all NHB fighters, or no holds barred, bare knuckle fighters, fighting for hot dogs pretty much. And the coach was a former USSR national assistant coach of the USSR wrestling team, who was working as a janitor. right? Anyway, so I started wrestling. Wrestling led me into judo purely because there's a competition outlet for judo. So I spent the next 3 or 4 years really embedded in sport fighting. I got really into that, won a lot of medals. Yeah, I got to represent my country. I got to do some cool stuff, but that became my focus. And then I started bouncing when I was 18, and bouncing when I was an 18-year-old kid who'd never been in a real fight. I'd been in sport fights. I'd been punched in the mouth by a bully once, but really I hadn't dealt with a reality of violence. All of a sudden I was like, wow, there are some pretty big gaps that I don't know what to do. I don't know how to deal with that pre-conflict adrenaline dump. Like when I know I've got to go talk to this guy and I am scared. I am scared of talking to this other male because he looks kind of tough. And if I ask him to do something and he doesn't do it, I have to make him do it. And that's scary, right? Being honest about that and being able to process those fears as a teenager and later in my early 20s, like, okay, how do I manage those situations? So I ended up going to train under Richard Dimitri when he came to Australia and did some seminars. I ended up becoming an instructor under Rich. Then I became very much reality-based self-defense guy with a side of combat sports. So I say all this because I kept sticking into my sporting. I love training sporting martial arts purely because I like the competition and I like to go hard and go live and to do those to free roll and to do those things. But the reality-based self-defense kind of gave me the especially the Senshido approach where it combines sort of MMA with knives and all that kind of other stuff. It's like, okay, at a certain point when I became a dad, I was like, well, do I need to know more physical stuff? Like, is the gap between life and death going to be that I didn't know how to do a really nice spinning back kick? Like, is that going to be the difference? Or is it going to be my judgment? Is it going to be my situational awareness? Is it going to be my ability to control my temper and not lose myself in the moment? And if I'm being honest with myself, like a level of maintenance training was more than enough because it was so embedded in me. I had the physical skills. I had a look. I mean, I'm a big guy, tattooed and usually shaved head. And I was not an attractive looking target, but my wife and kids might have been. So how do I protect them? So a big, I know we're going on massive tangents. I apologize.
Not at all.
Feel free to edit if we need to.
No, this is good.
So the company I work for, we do a lot of security consulting as well as violence prevention work and other things. But I was working on a project, basically hostile vehicle mitigation work. So counterterrorism, preventing vehicle-borne attacks. So I'd spent a good couple of weeks really embedded in researching every vehicle-borne attack I could find. So I think at that time, I think Nice had just happened. I'm just trying to think of the timing, but we had there was a number of vehicle-borne attacks in the last couple of years that we were looking at, and there was one here in Melbourne as well, at Burke Street Mall, where it wasn't a terrorist attack. It was a guy who was drugged up and had just stabbed his brother and was on the run from the police. And he was literally just doing burnouts, doing donuts in the middle of an intersection in the middle of the CBD on a busy day, and eventually either lost control of the car or deliberately, it's unclear, crashed into pedestrians on the side of the road. Now, that was a really tragic event because it was quite a number of people died. There was a baby that was killed. There was young children that were maimed and killed. And that was very topical. And because it happened, like obviously in my city, it was one of the incidents that I was really looking at very, very closely. There was a lot of footage. It was right in the middle of the CBD. There's a lot of CCTV. There's a lot of witness accounts. So I'm looking at this analytically to try and grab the learnings and how it apply a strategy to protect our clients' premises from this. And it was only maybe later that week or about a week later, I happened to be out with my family in the CBD where it happened. And I realized that we were standing on the very same corner. And at the timing was such that my fourth daughter had just been born. So she was about 6 weeks old. So I realized I'm looking around, I'm doing a quick threat assessment on what I've got in front of me. I've got my wife who's had a cesarean section 6 weeks ago, who's barely standing up the best of times. She had herniated disc, which she'd suffered during the pregnancy. We had a 2.5-year-old who was in a pram, and I had, let me see, what's the math? So I had a 4.5-year-old and a 6-year-old. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I'm standing here with a wife who's barely able to she certainly couldn't run. She was certainly not going to be able to run. Maybe life and death, possibly, but like not in any real capacity. I've got a newborn who's completely defenseless. I've got a 2.5-year-old in a pram, and I've got 2 other kids. What's my physical response to a threat here? And there isn't one. And it creeped me out because I was like, I for once feel like I can't protect my family, because my paradigm for protection was being able to run, being able to fight, being able to take out the bad guy. When really the paradigm for protection is I need to be I need to have my head on a swivel. I need to be thinking about where we're positioning, what barriers we've got between us and other people or other threats, and just not spending time in an exposed location. That's really the only thing. It's then, well, what point does that become counterproductive to your quality of life? So these are the questions that go into violence prevention. But being a parent, it's not just about fighting the bad guy. There's going to be bigger, badder guys and worse scenarios that doesn't matter how many black belts you have, it's not going to help you.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just a bad guy who's bigger than you, but the bad guy's buddy who is taking it to your kids and your wife while you're dealing with this one bad guy over here. The tactical situation changes entirely. My big come to Jesus on it was my oldest son. We adopted him when he was age 7, and he comes into the house, and that week I'm doing some gun disarms in a class, and I realized that every single one of the gun disarms it's the one where you capture it and you kind of put it to the side, and the barrel's kind of here at about hip level, going past you so it doesn't shoot you, but it's exactly at the height of my son's head.
Yeah. And you're like, well, how many reps have you done of that?
Yeah. So even if I do it correctly, it's exactly where I don't want it aimed. And that paradigm of all of those things we learned in the sport fighting. I also got into it originally through wrestling, because it's a good background, and then you get to like it. Then you graduate from high school and it's not available anymore, and you end up in martial arts. But that sport fighting doesn't train us to protect our kids, and then a lot of the combatives that you learn from a military application or a law enforcement application or civilian security application also doesn't really apply to what we do as a parent.
And just thinking about back to what we're talking about violence having consequences. You make a great point about it might not be the guy you're fighting, it might be someone else, but that someone else might be later. Like this doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen now. You embarrass a 19-year-old kid who's trying to steal your car in the middle of the night, and you scare him off, and he wets himself because he wasn't expecting to be interrupted. He gets back in the car with his buddies. You reckon they're not gonna razz him about that for months? And then he happens to see you when you're out at the supermarket a couple months later. You think it's not going to cross his mind that he might want to get some of his back because of the embarrassment you inflicted upon him when you did nothing wrong. You're just trying to stop someone stealing your car. I mean, those comeback attacks, and the fact that he could come back with friends to make an example out of you to get his honor back because that might be the only thing he's got that's worth fighting for. Those are the things those are the consequences of violence that if you don't live in that world, you don't want to be part of it. You don't want to have to concern yourself about comebacks and hierarchy and all those things that are everything to someone who lives that subculture. And it just comes back to what decisions are you making, and are you aware of the consequences? Because just last week saw Michael Falcao, the former UFC and Bellator fighter. Yeah, he was killed in a stabbing. Great fighter, professional fighter, got stabbed to death. And if you look into his life, I mean, he'd been arrested multiple times for fights, for domestic violence, for basically a pattern of making really bad decisions and being around criminals and consorting in places where bad things happen and being an abusive dick, it seems, a lot of the time. It doesn't matter what skills he had. You make enough bad decisions in a row, and eventually something's not going to go in your favor. So
exactly.
It's
the best defense against being stabbed is not being the kind of guy someone wants to stab.
Yeah, stop being so I had a student years ago. He said, I need to come to training with you because every time I go out, someone wants to fight me. I was like, have you considered not being so punchable? Like, I mean, what are you doing that every single time you leave the house, someone wants to hurt you? Like, that's not normal. Either you have a really badly selected friendship circle, or you're incredibly annoying. But it was the latter, right? He has had a chip on his shoulder. He had to back down. He's kind of a little guy, a little dog syndrome, where anyone glanced in his direction, he had to go and back him down to make sure he got his dignity back. And he just brought these situations upon himself. And it's funny when it's a 20-something-year-old guy and the consequence he gets punched in the mouth. It's not so funny when he's 35 and the consequences are he gets his kids growing up without a dad. Right.
Yeah. And that's one of those things. And that transition from being a stupid 20-something athletic male to being a dad, when that kid comes in your life, that first kid comes in your life, it's time to turn in the do stupid shit card.
Yeah.
That license has been revoked. And that can be a hard transition for a lot of guys.
100% it can. And it's something that you don't even realize at the time, but I mean, if you want to be a good dad, and I know plenty of people that aren't, but if you want to be a good dad, like what you want has to be secondary priority to what those kids need. And what those kids need is a dad who's around, who is not emotionally crippled, who is not dealing with his own traumas, who is not being arrested every second weekend. That's what that kid needs. So if that's the lifestyle you were living beforehand, you got to look at what decisions am I making and what decisions can I make to make sure I can be the kind of dad that kid needs. Because I don't know if you've had a chance to interview Matt Thornton or not, but he'd be a great guest to have. I'll try and put you in touch afterwards. But
that'd be fabulous.
Yeah, Matt is a legend of BJJ and Jeet Kune Do, and the creator of Straight Blast Gym International, but also just he's written a book about violence, which is incredible sociological view on violence. But in Matt's research, he said like the single biggest correlation to increased violence is fatherless kids. Like that is the one thing that you can connect in every society to an increased risk of violence is the kids growing up without fathers. So the more kids we have without fathers, the worse the world gets. And that's not a knock on single mums. Obviously, mums are doing the best thing they can, but it may connect to single parent families, but there's more no dad households and there are no mum households. So perhaps the statistic works the same way. It's hard to say. But without that stabilizing male influence in a kid's life, there's a higher chance that a son will become violent or unstable or in some way socially deficient without that balance. So if that's the case, then anything that I do that has a chance, I mean, I've got daughters, but the same thing applies. Anything that I were to do that's going to increase the odds of me not being there is a detriment to my kids. Okay, I successfully defend myself. Great. You're going to jail for 6 months. What was the net benefit? Maybe I would have been better off taking the black eye.
Or engaging those awareness and avoidance skills where the guy wanted to swing at you, but he was on the other side of a table and couldn't reach.
There's 1,000 things that maybe might have happened. But,
exactly.
And violence has consequences, and it's not always about the injury or the immediate legal aftermath. It's sometimes much deeper.
Yeah, and before and after. Well, Joe, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. I really appreciate it. Before you go, is there any particular subject that you don't get enough opportunity to hold forth on?
It used to be communication skills, but then I just started shoehorning it in everywhere, and now people recognize that that's what I talk about, and they ask me about it. So, I think I've kind of had enough conversations on the record now that people didn't know what to ask me about. So I haven't had to force that one for a while.
Okay. Joe's just going to talk about communication and conflict for a while, so I'm going to go. I'll be back.
Honestly, it's like, okay, well, if you bring me on, these are the things I like to talk about. These are the things that I'm good at, and I've just had the same conversation with some of my hosts with the UK seminar tour coming up. And if you are listening from the UK and you want to check it out, go to violencepod.com/UK tour. It's got all the dates up there. But one of the things I was talking about was like So some of my hosts were like, "Oh, we'd like you to do a combative seminar. We'd like you to do a judo seminar." And I'm more than happy to do it, and I've got some takes on that, and I've got some material on that I'm happy to share. But like, use me for what I'm best at. Like, there are people in your own country that are better combatives than me. There are people in your own country that are better at judo than me. Use me for the stuff that I'm one of the better ones at. Right? I'm not going to say I'm the best, but like, let's start. Like, if you're gonna fly me all the way to your country, get the best stuff out of me. Don't just do this already done that you can get done in your own country. So, yeah,
that makes really good sense. Well, thank you again, Joe, and we'll put the links to your show and to your website and your seminars in the show notes for everybody so they can track you down. And thank you for coming on. Thank you everybody for watching. Stay safe. We'll see you all next time.